A black woman stood outside the hotel she built, unwelcome and unseen. The wind cut through her coat, but the silence cut deeper. Today, dignity would demand more than just entry. She stood outside the hotel she built, cold wind slicing through her coat like the silence slicing through her dignity. Inside, warmth danced off crystal chandeliers. Outside, a 63-year-old black woman was invisible by design. The young receptionist didn't ask for a name, didn't glance twice, just smiled thinly and lied, "We're at full capacity." But 5 rooms blinked green behind her, vacant, untouched, truth, glowing, ignored. Naomi Freeman didn't argue, didn't explain. She simply turned and walked. Because she'd seen this story before, in restrooms labeled colored, in job applications tossed by skin tone, in her son's cuffs, in her father's bowed back. But this time, she wrote the ending. Tomorrow, someone would be fired, someone would be lifted, and an entire hotel empire would learn the difference between service and submission. She wasn't just testing them. She was testing the soul of the American dream. She didn't come in through the executive entrance. She didn't wear the title that once turned heads or the suit that opened doors. She came alone, her coat thin, her hair tied back, her skin the same shade as the woman they had just turned away. No red carpet, no welcome glass of wine, just silence, and 5 glowing vacancies behind the front desk monitor. Naomi Freeman had once signed the deed to this place. She had overseen every line of marble flooring, every velvet-backed chair in the lobby, every stitch in the staff uniforms. But on this winter afternoon, none of that mattered. They saw a 63-year-old black woman in discount shoes asking for a room without a reservation. And just like that, she became invisible. The receptionist, young, white, freshly hired from a hospitality college in Ohio, didn't recognize her. That wasn't the problem. The problem was, she didn't even look up long enough to consider that she might matter. "We're at full capacity," she said flatly, without checking the system. But Naomi had already seen the screen. 5 rooms, still green, still open. She didn't speak. She didn't protest. Instead, she turned slowly, with the grace of someone who had walked through worse storms, and stepped back into the wind that clawed at her coat. What the receptionist didn't know was that Naomi had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She remembered the first time she saw her father cry. It was 1964. He had come home from his night shift at the Gulf Crest Motel in Birmingham, his uniform soaked in bleach, his knuckles raw. He'd been screamed at by a white guest for entering the wrong hallway. "Boy," they'd called him, though he was a decorated Korean War veteran. That night, her mother wiped his hands with warm water and hummed a hymn through her teeth to drown out his shame. She remembered the day her son stopped drawing. He was 17, standing outside a bus stop in the South Loop, when a wallet went missing nearby. The real thief ran. But her son? He stood still. That was enough. The police said he matched the description. No charges were filed, but something in him broke. For 3 years, he wouldn't touch a pencil. His sketches, once full of light and invention, had been silenced by suspicion. And now, here Naomi was, decades later, still asked to prove she belonged. This wasn't a glitch. It was a ritual. One her body had been rehearsing since birth. But Naomi Freeman didn't come here to be accepted. She came to remember and to reveal. Because this story doesn't begin in the lobby. It starts in every invisible moment that builds the lobby. It begins in the bowed backs of cleaning ladies who memorized the names of guests who never bothered to learn theirs. It begins in the polished shoes of doormen who've held umbrellas over white shoulders in the rain and been mistaken for statues the moment they aged. It begins in the silence of housekeepers like Amaya, who watched her manager mock her accent behind her back and chose to stay, not out of fear, but because rent doesn't wait for dignity. Naomi had seen all of it, and she had written none of it off. So when she returned the next day, wearing the same coat, the same worn shoes, and a voice that didn't need raising, she booked the cheapest available room. 3 vacancies remained, enough to confirm the truth. And this time, she stayed, not just in the room, but in the building, in the hallways, in the eyes of staff who suddenly realized the woman who had been turned away now walked like she owned the place, because she did. Naomi didn't hold a press conference. She didn't storm out. She observed. She saw the head of security scold an elderly black guard for letting a guest park near the lobby. "That's not regulation, old man," he snapped, loud enough for guests to hear. The guard bowed his head and took the warning, though his hands had been guiding cars since long before that manager learned how to tie a tie. She saw the kitchen assistant wipe tears during her lunch break. Her mother had been rushed to the hospital the night before, and she was still asked to carry trays and brew coffee for the finance team upstairs. "Don't get behind," the accountant barked, never asking why she looked broken. She saw, she listened, and then she called a meeting. One by one, the staff filed in, unsure, cautious, many expecting reprimand. But Naomi didn't raise her voice. She raised a mirror. "What kind of house," she asked, "turns away its heartbeat?" And from that question came a revolution. Not loud, not viral, but real. The rude manager resigned. The elderly guard became a mentor to the next generation of staff. The kitchen assistant received full medical leave, plus a promotion. A new scholarship fund was created for employees' children, called the Legacy Room. And Naomi? She never raised her title above anyone's head. She just made sure the next time a black woman walked through those doors, she wouldn't need to explain why she mattered. Because justice doesn't always knock. Sometimes it checks in quietly and changes everything. The lobby was polished to perfection, but what happened behind the front desk was anything but. Naomi Freeman had seen enough in her lifetime to know. Rot never begins in the marble. It begins in the silence between orders, in how one person looks down and the other forgets to look up. So she stayed, not as a guest, but as a witness. The young white receptionist who had first turned her away, Alyssa, wasn't evil. But she was untrained in empathy, raised in a culture of coded glances and professional instincts that always seemed to fail in the same direction. She had only been working the desk for a year, barely 25, and already she had learned to judge by handbag, posture, and tone. She thought she was protecting the brand, but what she was doing, Naomi realized, was preserving a wound. It wasn't long before Naomi noticed the hotel manager. His name was Eric Denton. Sharp suit, sharp tongue, always walking fast, constantly correcting someone. At first glance, he looked like the face of authority, polished, prepared, in control. But Naomi had a talent for listening between the lines. "Does it take you this long to vacuum every hallway?" he snapped one afternoon at the housekeeping team. His voice wasn't raised, but it struck like a whip. "You're not being paid to socialize." The man he was barking at? Tyrone Harris, 61 years old, housekeeper, widower, and sole guardian to his 10-year-old granddaughter, who was at home that day because her school had cancelled for a sudden teacher strike. Tyrone hadn't called into work. He couldn't afford to. He brought his granddaughter's drawing in his lunchbox and left her a peanut butter sandwich and a prayer. He'd never been late, never complained. But now, standing under Eric Denton's scowl, he looked like a boy again, apologizing for breathing too loudly in a world that had long forgotten he built it. And Naomi watched. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She wrote it down. She saw the security guard, Mr. Reggie, who was too old, trying his best to help a guest find parking when the garage was full. He pointed to a spot near the front entrance, wide enough for a quick unload. The guest was running late for a funeral. Reggie did what any decent person would. He showed grace. But Denton caught him. "This isn't a bus station," he hissed. "You want to play valet? Write your resignation first." Reggie didn't speak, but Naomi saw it, the way his jaw set like a man trying not to choke on humiliation. And then there was finance. Numbers, neat and cold. No room for kindness, especially not from its head. Meredith Sloan, white, 48, always in heels sharp enough to slice ego. When one of her junior accountants, a black woman named Patrice, missed a morning meeting because she'd spent the night in the ER with her mother, Meredith didn't ask a single question. "If you can't manage your personal life, how can I trust you with company numbers?" she snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. Patrice said nothing. She had never said anything. She brought the coffee, carried the reports, smiled, always smiled. Naomi knew that smile. She'd worn it for years. So she called a meeting. Everyone came. Some confused, some curious. Most thought it was just another dry operations update. But then Naomi stood. She didn't use slides, didn't hand out reports. She used her voice, her history, her truth. She called things by their names. "This hotel runs on silence," she said. "The kind that wraps around power like perfume. But silence doesn't build loyalty. It breeds fear." She called out names, not to shame, but to shed light on them. She praised Tyrone's consistency, Reggie's dignity, and Patrice's endurance. And then she looked toward the staff and said, "If you have been carrying the weight of someone else's pride, speak now, not to destroy, but to restore." And that's when the kitchen supervisor stood. Her name was Elena, Latina, 43, had been silent for years. "I've seen it," she said. "All of it. The rudeness, the bias, the fear. I thought it wasn't my place to say anything. But maybe that was the problem." The room was still. That's when Naomi nodded and said, "It is now." That day, the ground began to shift. Not with outrage, but with honesty. Because nothing heals until someone says, "I saw what happened, and I won't look away again." The staff conference room had never felt heavier. Naomi Freeman stood at the head, not behind a podium, but beside the table, eye to eye with every person in the room. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. Not the weight of punishment, but of reckoning. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to remind everyone of something simple. This hotel was not built for perfection. It was built for dignity." Silence. She nodded to Lauren, the new interim manager, to begin reading the names of those who would be promoted. Applause followed, measured, hopeful, but uncertain. No one knew what was coming next, until Naomi turned to the man who had once ruled the lobby like a throne. "Mr. Connor," she said evenly, "you've been with us for 5 years. You've upheld policies, enforced standards, but in doing so, you forgot what those standards were meant to protect." The room stiffened. Connor's jaw tightened. "You were given power, and you used it not to elevate others, but to diminish them. You punished age, overlooked integrity, silenced discomfort, and allowed fear to masquerade as protocol. You erased warmth with condescension. He opened his mouth, but Naomi raised her hand. This is not a courtroom. This is clarity. She reached into her folder, pulled out a single sheet. The list of formal complaints, guest feedback, and internal warnings, all bearing his name. You have failed not because of one mistake, but because you created a culture where people were afraid to speak. He looked down. No apology came. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated, she said. Security will escort you out. You may collect your things quietly. The room held its breath. Connor stood slowly, stiff as stone, and made for the door. But before he exited, Naomi spoke once more. May this moment teach you what leadership never did. Respect is not about control. It's about how you choose to see people when no one is watching. He didn't look back. When the door clicked shut, something shifted in the air. Naomi turned back to the team, her voice now steady with purpose. We are not here to shame. We are here to grow. This isn't just a hotel. It's a reflection of who we choose to be. And today, we choose better. In that moment, the hotel's soul began to change, and the American dream, once denied to so many, took one quiet step closer to being a reality for everyone. The morning after the confrontation, the hotel lobby was quiet, but not the quiet of tension. It was the stillness that follows a storm, when the air clears and something new begins to settle. Naomi Freeman didn't issue a press release. She didn't grandstand. She walked into the staff lounge, no stage, no microphone, just presence, and began with a single truth. This place was built to serve people, not just the ones who tip well, not just the ones who look like they belong, everyone. By that afternoon, an internal memo circulated across every department. Effective immediately, a cultural audit task force would be launched to review both behaviors and numbers. A new internal investigations unit, led by staff representatives, would collect anonymous experiences without fear of retaliation. A future first fund would be established, offering scholarships to employees' children, emergency paid leave for caregivers, and dignity without having to rely on handouts. It wasn't corporate charity. It was a course correction. Naomi met with every department head, not to reprimand, but to listen. Lauren James, the interim manager, was officially promoted. Not because she played safe, but because she spoke when it was hardest. Housekeeping staff, who had been ignored for years, now sat at round tables, offering suggestions for guest flow and service design. Front desk training was overhauled, not just to check reservations, but to check bias. Signs began to shift, not bigger, just different. One hung quietly in the back room where staff clocked in. People walk in with more than luggage. Make sure they leave with more than a receipt. Down the block, meanwhile, a once-polished man gripped the steering wheel of a boxy delivery truck. Stephen Lane, former hotel manager, now driving 18-wheelers for a freight company, stared out past the highway shoulder. He'd been turned down by 4 hotels in his job search, and word spreads. His last interview ended when a regional HR director asked, "Weren't you the guy from that Naomi Freeman story?" Now, hauling crates of bottled water across Illinois backroads, he had time to think. Too much of it. He replayed it often, the way he raised his voice in front of guests, the way he dismissed seasoned employees, the way he ignored complaints because they were too emotional. And worst, how quick he was to defend a smile that masked bias. He hadn't meant to be cruel. However, most people don't. It wasn't until the engine hummed on mile marker 47, his hands rougher than he remembered, that the thought finally sank in. It wasn't the system that ruined him. It was the silence he allowed to grow inside him. He had power once. He used it to protect comfort, not people. Now he had mirrors, long ones, rear view, and behind him, a hotel transformed. Naomi hadn't just fired him. She'd rewritten what leadership means. Weeks later, the hotel no longer glistened just from marble floors or polished brass. It shimmered with something more profound: awareness. Guests still sipped champagne in the lounge, but now the bellhops greeted every walk-in with eye contact and warmth. Housekeeping staff were thanked by name. And the woman who once stood in the cold with 5 rooms glowing behind the front desk? She now stood at the heart of a movement. Naomi Freeman didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need applause. What she said at the company's quarterly gathering didn't go viral. It didn't trend. But it stayed. She stood at the podium in a dark suit, her voice low but firm, and said, "People walk in with more than luggage. Make sure they leave with more than a receipt." The room was silent, not because they didn't understand, but because they finally did. It wasn't about policy. It was about presence. It wasn't about hotel ratings. It was about how dignity is distributed, often unequally, room by room, glance by glance. In that silence, employees remembered moments. When they judged someone by their shoes before their story. When they saw injustice, they kept their heads down. When they believed service meant submission, not respect. But that era was over. Now, quarterly cultural reviews were as routine as fire drills. HR no longer just looked for experience, they looked for empathy. Scholarships from the Future First Fund went to children of janitors and night shift cooks. Even exit interviews asked new questions. Did you feel seen? Did you feel safe? And guests. Guests noticed the difference, not in amenities, but in atmosphere. They no longer felt like intruders when they weren't in suits or heels. They felt like humans, welcome. Naomi's story spread, not as a scandal, but as a signal. Other chains began asking different questions. Conferences invited her not as a diversity case study, but as a business strategist with heart. Yet she never took credit. Because this wasn't about a single woman proving her worth, it was about reminding a nation, still fractured by history, that excellence is not defined by skin color, clothing, or wealth. It is defined by how we treat people when we think no one is watching. And that is what made her message stick. Not because it was loud, but because it rang true. A reminder carved into company culture, passed from shift to shift like an heirloom. This isn't just a hotel. It's someone's story. Make sure you honor it. And from that day forward, no guest ever left without being seen. Not again. You may forget the name of a hotel, but you never forget how they made you feel. Naomi Freeman walked in unnoticed, but walked out unforgettable. Not because she raised her voice, but because she revealed the truth. Service means nothing without respect. And sometimes, the quietest people leave the loudest legacy. This wasn't just her story. It's ours. About how we see each other, how we treat each other, and what we allow in silence. So now we ask you, which part of this story spoke to you? Comment below. Please share it. Because change starts with stories like these. And you, yes, you, are part of the story now. Subscribe to the channel for many valuable lessons. Let's keep building a world where everyone is seen, where no one walks out feeling small. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one.